The warm afternoon sun streamed through the massive windows of JFK International Airport as Dr. Amara Okafor made her way through the crowded Terminal 4. Her black heels clicked softly against the polished floor, echoing the confidence she had earned through 15 years of diplomatic service at the United Nations. Today, however, something felt different in the air. At 42 years old, Dr. Okafor had flown through hundreds of airports. She knew their rhythms, their patterns, and their procedures like the back of her hand. She had just returned from an important UN conference in Geneva, where she had led discussions on international aid distribution. The 16-hour journey, with a short layover in London, had left her tired but still professional in her appearance. She wore a navy blue suit that she had carefully chosen that morning, crisp, elegant, and befitting her position as a senior UN diplomat. Her diplomatic passport and credentials were securely tucked in her leather handbag, documents she had presented countless times before without any issue. Her small carry-on suitcase rolled smoothly behind her, containing just enough clothes for the week-long conference she had attended. The terminal was unusually busy for a Thursday afternoon. Families with crying children, business people typing furiously on their phones, and tourists with oversized backpacks all merged into a slow-moving river of humanity. The air conditioning hummed overhead, barely keeping up with the heat generated by so many bodies in one space. Dr. Okafor checked her watch, 2:45 p.m. She had a meeting at the UN headquarters at 5:00 p.m., plenty of time to clear immigration and catch a taxi into Manhattan. She joined the diplomatic line at immigration, shorter than the regular ones but moving surprisingly slowly today. She noticed the immigration officer at her booth. Officer Jenkins, according to his name tag, seemed to be taking longer than usual with each passenger. As she waited, Dr. Okafor replied to several urgent emails on her phone. The humanitarian crisis she had been discussing in Geneva needed immediate attention. Her Nigerian accent mixed with her perfect English as she quietly dictated voice messages to her team. A young intern had just sent her the latest statistics on food distribution in refugee camps, numbers that made her frown with concern. The line moved forward slowly. Dr. Okafor observed the other passengers around her. To her right, a European diplomat chatted casually with his colleague. To her left, an Asian woman in a business suit sorted through her documents. The overhead speakers continuously played automated security messages, their words blending into the general buzz of the terminal. Finally, it was her turn. Dr. Okafor approached the immigration booth with her usual professional smile. The glass barrier between her and Officer Jenkins was spotted with fingerprints from thousands of previous travelers. She noticed immediately that Officer Jenkins didn't return her smile, not unusual for immigration officers, but something in his expression made her slightly uneasy. "Good afternoon," she said, sliding her diplomatic passport and credentials through the small opening in the glass. The dark blue passport with its gold UN insignia had opened doors for her across the world. She had presented it in more countries than she could count, from small airport terminals in war-torn regions to the most sophisticated borders in the world. Officer Jenkins picked up her passport with what seemed like unusual suspicion. His eyes darted between her face and the document. Dr. Okafor maintained her composed demeanor, though she couldn't help but notice his hand tightening around her passport. The air conditioning vent above suddenly felt colder. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly, noticing that he had been examining her passport for much longer than necessary. She had dealt with extra scrutiny before, but something about Officer Jenkins's demeanor was different. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he had already made some sort of judgment. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the immigration booth as Officer Jenkins reached for his phone. Dr. Okafor's diplomatic training told her to stay calm, but her instincts warned her that this was not going to be a routine entry. She glanced at her watch again, 3:00 p.m. Her upcoming meeting seemed suddenly far less certain as Officer Jenkins began dialing a number, her passport still firmly gripped in his other hand. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would not only change Dr. Okafor's life, it would also spark an international incident that would force America to confront uncomfortable truths about its immigration system and racial biases. Officer Jenkins held the phone to his ear while staring at Dr. Okafor's diplomatic passport. His free hand drummed against the counter in a way that made other travelers turn their heads. "Yeah, I'm going to need a supervisor down here," he said into the phone. "Got a situation at booth 14. He hung up without taking his eyes off the passport. Officer, may I ask what seems to be the problem? Dr. Okafor's voice remained steady, though she could feel her heart beating faster. The line behind her was growing longer, and whispers started floating through the air. She noticed a young mother pulling her child closer, as if trouble was something contagious. Ma'am, this passport appears to be fake, Officer Jenkins announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. His voice carried a tone of triumph, as if he had just solved a difficult puzzle. The paper quality isn't right, and I've never seen a diplomatic passport like this before. Dr. Okafor took a deep breath. She had faced discrimination before, but rarely so blatant, so public. Officer Jenkins, she said, reading his name tag again, I assure you that is an authentic United Nations diplomatic passport. If you look at page 3, you'll find my UN identification number, which you can verify with. Ma'am, please step aside, Jenkins interrupted, waving over two more officers who had appeared behind him. They were both tall men with stern expressions, their hands resting casually on their belts. We need to investigate this further. The growing crowd of onlookers made Dr. Okafor increasingly uncomfortable. She could see phones being raised, their cameras capturing this moment. A businessman in an expensive suit shook his head and muttered something to his colleague. Whether in sympathy or judgment, she couldn't tell. I have additional identification, Dr. Okafor said, reaching for her UN badge. Officer Jenkins's hand immediately shot up in a stopping motion, causing her to freeze mid-movement. The terminal's usual buzz of conversation had dulled to a whisper around their booth. Don't reach for anything else, he commanded sharply. Officer Rodriguez, please escort the subject to secondary inspection. The younger officer stepped forward, his face showing a flicker of uncertainty that his senior partner lacked. Dr. Okafor stood her ground. I am a United Nations diplomat with full diplomatic immunity under the Vienna Convention. You can verify this with one phone call to the UN mission or the State Department. She pulled out her phone. In fact, I will make that call right now. Phone's away, Jenkins barked, his face reddening. This is a secure area. His supervisor, a woman named Officer Chen according to her badge, finally arrived at the scene. She looked from Jenkins to Dr. Okafor, trying to assess the situation. What's going on here, Jenkins? Officer Chen asked, her tone professional but cautious. Before Jenkins could answer, Dr. Okafor spoke up. Your officer is refusing to recognize my diplomatic passport and is preventing me from providing additional identification or contacting the UN mission, she explained calmly. I have been a UN diplomat for 15 years, and I've never experienced such treatment. Officer Chen reached for the passport, but Jenkins pulled it back. Sarah, look at this. The paper feels wrong. The watermark isn't right. We got a sophisticated forgery here. His voice carried absolute certainty. The crowd had grown larger. Some passengers delayed their own journeys to watch the scene unfold. A young woman in a hijab looked particularly worried, perhaps seeing her own future travels reflected in this moment. Sir, Dr. Okafor tried one more time, if you would just contact. Oh, I'm contacting someone all right. Jenkins cut her off, reaching for something in his desk drawer. The fluorescent lights glinted off a pair of scissors he pulled out. And since this is a fraudulent document, protocol says we need to invalidate it immediately. Officer Chen's eyes widened. Jenkins, wait. But it was too late. The scissors were already moving toward the passport, their metal blades reflecting the harsh airport lighting. Dr. Okafor's years of diplomatic training couldn't prepare her for what happened next. Time seemed to slow down as she watched Officer Jenkins position the scissors at the corner of her diplomatic passport. The sound of metal cutting through paper echoed in her ears, mixing with the gasps from the crowd. In that moment, Dr. Okafor knew that this was no longer just about her. This was about to become an international incident. The sound of scissors cutting through paper seemed to echo through Terminal 4. Dr. Okafor watched in horror as her diplomatic passport, the document that represented not just her identity, but the sovereignty of the United Nations, was mutilated before her eyes. The dark blue cover now hung in two jagged pieces, held together by just a few threads. There, Officer Jenkins said with satisfaction, holding up the damaged passport. Now no one else can use this fake document. His voice carried a hint of pride that made several onlookers shake their heads in disbelief. Dr. Okafor's hand moved to her phone with remarkable steadiness, despite the anger and shock coursing through her body. She started recording, her years of diplomatic training kicking in. "I want to be very clear about what just happened," she said, her voice carrying across the now silent terminal. "This officer has just deliberately destroyed a United Nations diplomatic passport, violating multiple international laws and conventions." Officer Chen, the supervisor, had gone pale. Unlike Jenkins, she seemed to understand the gravity of what had just happened. "Jenkins, stop everything," she ordered, but it was far too late. The damage was done, captured on not just Dr. Okafor's phone, but dozens of others in the crowd. A young law student in the crowd spoke up. "That's a violation of the Vienna Convention," she called out. Others in the crowd began murmuring, many holding up their phones to record the incident. The terminal had become eerily quiet except for these whispers and the constant click of camera phones. Dr. Okafor pressed a speed dial number on her phone. "This is Dr. Amara Okafor," she said clearly into the device. "I need to speak with Ambassador Williams immediately. This is an emergency." She kept her phone in one hand, recording with the other, as she watched Officer Jenkins finally begin to show signs of uncertainty. The crowd had grown larger, with airport staff trying unsuccessfully to disperse the onlookers. A flight crew passing by stopped to watch. The captain, recognizing the significance of a diplomatic passport being destroyed, immediately pulled out his own phone and appeared to be calling airline authorities. "You can't make phone calls in this area." Jenkins tried one last time to assert authority, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Officer Chen put a hand on his shoulder, finally taking control of the situation. "Dr. Okafor," Officer Chen said, stepping forward. "On behalf of the airport authority, I want tow." "Please do not apologize yet," Dr. Okafor interrupted firmly. "Right now, I need you to contact your highest-ranking airport official. I also need the names and badge numbers of everyone involved in this incident." Her voice remained professional, but there was steel behind her words. A new figure pushed through the crowd, a tall man in an airline pilot's uniform. "Dr. Okafor," he called out. "I'm Captain Stevens from United Airlines. I just contacted our airport operations team. They're calling State Department officials right now." The terminal's atmosphere had changed completely. The usual hurried pace of airport life had frozen around booth 14. Passengers with connecting flights stayed anyway, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Parents lifted children to see better, whispering explanations about diplomacy and racial profiling. Dr. Okafor's phone buzzed. "Yes, Mr. Ambassador," she said into it, her eyes never leaving Officer Jenkins. "I am currently standing at JFK Terminal 4, where my diplomatic passport has just been deliberately destroyed by an immigration officer who claimed it was fake. Yes, sir, I am recording everything." "Yes, sir, I understand." She turned to address the growing crowd, her voice clear and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you all to understand what has happened here today. I am a United Nations diplomat representing humanitarian causes across the world. This officer took one look at me and decided I couldn't possibly be who I said I was. He didn't verify. He didn't check. He simply decided, and then he destroyed my passport." The words hung in the air as more officials began arriving at the scene. Security personnel tried to create a perimeter, but it was too late. Social media was already exploding with videos of the incident. Somewhere in the crowd, a child asked loudly, "Mommy, why did the police officer cut up her passport?" The innocent question seemed to pierce the tension, making several people wince. Dr. Okafor stood tall, her phone still recording, as Chow swirled around her. In just a few minutes, this incident would reach the UN headquarters, the State Department, and countless social media feeds around the world. What started as one officer's prejudiced decision was about to become a diplomatic crisis that would force America to confront its deepest biases. Within 15 minutes of the passport-cutting incident, Terminal 4 at JFK had transformed into a scene of barely controlled chaos. Men and women in dark suits rushed through the crowd, their badges swinging from lanyards as they hurried toward booth 14. Dr. Okafor stood calmly at the center of the storm, still recording everything on her phone. "Ma'am, I'm David Richardson, Chief of Airport Security," a gray-haired man said, slightly out of breath from running. He looked at the cut passport on the counter and wiped sweat from his forehead. We got State Department officials on their way. They'll be here in 10 minutes. Officer Jenkins, who had been so confident earlier, now sat in a corner with his head in his hands. Officer Chen was frantically filling out incident reports, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote. The gravity of the situation was finally sinking in for everyone involved. "Do you understand what you've done?" A sharp voice cut through the noise. A woman in a tailored suit pushed through the crowd, holding up her State Department credentials. "I'm Sarah Martinez, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security. Dr. Okafor, on behalf of the United States government, I want to." "Ms. Martinez," Dr. Okafor interrupted politely but firmly, "I believe we should save the apologies for official channels. Right now, I need to understand how this happened and what steps are being taken to secure the scene." The crowd of onlookers had doubled in size. News reporters were starting to arrive, held back by airport security, but already shouting questions. Through the terminal windows, camera crews could be seen setting up their equipment outside. Officer Jenkins finally looked up, his face ashen. A colleague was showing him something on a phone, probably one of the many viral videos of the incident that were already spreading across social media. The hashtag diplomatic crisis was trending, and the UN press office had just released its first statement. "Sir," a young airport staff member approached Richardson, holding a tablet. "The Nigerian ambassador is on the line. He's demanding to speak with someone in charge." Richardson's face turned a shade paler as he took the tablet with trembling hands. Dr. Okafor's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and saw messages pouring in from diplomatic missions worldwide. The incident was no longer just a personal humiliation. It had become an international diplomatic crisis. "Dr. Okafor," Martinez said, trying again, "we have a private room prepared where we can discuss this situation." She gestured toward a door marked "Staff Only." "The Secretary of State has been notified and is personally monitoring the situation." Before Dr. Okafor could respond, another commotion arose at the terminal entrance. A team of UN security officers in their distinctive uniforms arrived, led by the head of diplomatic security. They moved with purpose through the crowd, their presence adding another layer of authority to the scene. "The United Nations takes any attack on its diplomatic staff extremely seriously," the head of security announced, his voice carrying across the terminal. "This incident will be treated as an attack on the United Nations itself." Officer Jenkins, hearing these words, slumped further in his chair. Someone had brought him a copy of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, open to the section about diplomatic passport privileges. His hands trembled as he read the consequences of his actions. A young black girl in the crowd tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Is that lady important?" she asked, pointing at Dr. Okafor. Her mother nodded, tears in her eyes. "Very important, baby. And somebody made a very big mistake today." The airport's emergency response team had set up a perimeter, but they couldn't contain the story that was already spreading across the globe. On overhead TV screens throughout the terminal, news tickers began displaying headlines about the incident. Passengers delayed their own journeys to witness this historic moment. Dr. Okafor checked her watch again. Just 45 minutes had passed since Officer Jenkins first looked at her passport with suspicion. In that short time, his biased decision had sparked an international incident that would have repercussions for years to come. As she followed Martinez toward the private room, Dr. Okafor knew that this moment would change not just her life, but the way America handled diplomatic relations and confronted its own prejudices. By nightfall, the incident at JFK Airport had become the top story on every major news network. In the UN headquarters crisis management room, officials watched multiple screens showing news coverage from around the world. Dr. Okafor's face appeared on each one, alongside footage of Officer Jenkins cutting her diplomatic passport. "This is Christine Chen reporting live from JFK Airport," a reporter announced on CNN. Where earlier today, what should have been a routine immigration check turned into an international diplomatic crisis. Behind her, protesters had already gathered outside the terminal, holding signs that read "Diplomacy Matters" and "Stop Racial Profiling." In Nigeria, the reaction was explosive. The Nigerian president called an emergency press conference at 1 a.m. local time. "The treatment of Dr. Okafor is not just an insult to her, but to every African diplomat who travels internationally," he declared, his voice sharp with anger. We demand immediate action from the United States government. Social media platforms were flooded with the video. Celebrity activists shared it, politicians commented on it, and ordinary people expressed their outrage. A technology expert in Silicon Valley noted that the hashtag diplomatic passport incident was being used more than 2 million times per hour. Inside a secure conference room at the State Department, Dr. Okafor sat at a long table surrounded by senior officials. Her cut passport lay in an evidence bag at the center of the table, a stark reminder of how quickly prejudice could override protocol. The UN Secretary General has issued a statement, an aide announced, reading from his tablet. He condemns this incident in the strongest possible terms and calls for a complete review of how diplomatic credentials are verified in U.S. ports of entry. Dr. Okafor's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the incident. Messages of support poured in from diplomatic missions worldwide. The French ambassador had called it unconscionable. The South African Diplomatic Corps announced they would wear black armbands in solidarity. At JFK, Officer Jenkins had been escorted from the premises. His union representative made a brief statement. Officer Jenkins deeply regrets his actions and acknowledges his grave error in judgment. But the damage was done. Airport staff whispered that they had never seen such a high-level response to an incident. Dr. Okafor, the Deputy Secretary of State, said, entering the conference room, "The President would like to speak with you." She handed Dr. Okafor a secure phone. The room fell silent as the President's voice came through, offering a personal apology and promising swift action. Outside in Times Square, the incident played on the massive video screens. Tourists stopped to watch, many taking pictures with their phones. A street artist had already created a mural showing a pair of scissors cutting through a passport, with the words "Never Again" painted in bold letters. Back at the UN, emergency meetings were being called. The African Union demanded an extraordinary session to discuss the treatment of African diplomats. The incident had touched a nerve, bringing to the surface years of accumulated grievances about racial profiling in international travel. Dr. Okafor's office at the UN was flooded with flowers and cards from colleagues. Her secretary had stopped counting after the 100th call from media outlets requesting interviews. Even her old professor from Oxford University had reached out, saying he would use this case in his diplomatic relations course. "Look at this," a junior diplomat said, showing Dr. Okafor his phone. Celebrity influencers were changing their profile pictures to images of diplomatic passports in solidarity. A famous filmmaker had already announced plans to make a documentary about the incident. Late that night, as New York's lights twinkled outside her office window, Dr. Okafor finally had a moment alone. She looked at the cut passport in its evidence bag, thinking about how a single act of prejudice had sparked a global conversation about dignity, respect, and diplomatic relations. Her phone buzzed one more time, a message from a young black girl who had been in the airport crowd. "Dear Dr. Okafor," it read, "today you showed me that we must stand tall even when others try to cut us down. Thank you for your dignity." The message brought the first tears of the day to Dr. Okafor's eyes, reminding her that sometimes the most painful moments could become the most powerful catalysts for change. 3 days after the passport incident, Washington, D.C. buzzed with unprecedented activity. The marble halls of the State Department echoed with hurried footsteps as officials prepared for what would become one of the most significant press conferences in recent diplomatic history. The grand briefing room was packed with journalists from around the world. Camera crews jostled for position as Secretary of State Catherine Morrison approached the podium. Behind her stood an impressive group: the Nigerian ambassador, the UN Secretary General's representative, and Dr. Okafor herself. "Good morning," Secretary Morrison began, her voice firm and clear. "Today, I stand before you to address the deeply troubling incident that occurred at JFK International Airport. First and foremost, on behalf of the United States government, I offer our most sincere and unequivocal apology to Dr. Amara Okafor." Cameras clicked rapidly as the secretary continued. "We have launched a comprehensive investigation into this incident. Officer Jenkins has been terminated from his position, and his supervisor has been placed on administrative leave pending further review." In the front row, a young reporter from an African news network raised her hand. "What specific changes will be implemented to prevent such incidents in the future?" The secretary gestured to a thick document on the podium. "Today, we are announcing the Diplomatic Credentials Respect Act, or DCRA. This executive order implements immediate changes in how we handle diplomatic documentation at all U.S. ports of entry. Dr. Okafor watched from her position on the stage, noting how different this room felt from the chaotic airport terminal just days ago. Her phone buzzed silently in her pocket. Another message from the young girl who had witnessed the incident. They had been exchanging messages daily since then. The DCRA includes mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all border officers, the secretary explained. We're also implementing a new digital verification system for diplomatic credentials, developed in consultation with the United Nations Diplomatic Security Service. Outside the State Department, protesters still gathered daily, but their signs had changed from anger to calls for reform. Make change permanent, and reform immigration now had replaced the earlier, more confrontational messages. A senior White House correspondent stood up. Dr. Okafor, will you be involved in implementing these changes? All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward to the podium. Yes, she replied, her voice steady. I have accepted the State Department's invitation to co-chair the new Diplomatic Relations and Cultural Awareness Committee. Sometimes, painful experiences can become powerful tools for positive change. In New York, the UN Security Council had just concluded an emergency session on the treatment of diplomatic personnel worldwide. The incident had prompted other nations to examine their own procedures for handling diplomatic credentials. Back in the briefing room, Secretary Morrison unveiled another initiative. We're establishing a 24-hour diplomatic credential verification hotline. No passport will ever be destroyed or confiscated without multiple levels of verification and approval. The Nigerian ambassador stepped forward to make his statement. While we cannot undo what happened to Dr. Okafor, we appreciate the swift and comprehensive response from the United States government. This incident has opened important discussions about respect, dignity, and diplomatic relations. Social media continued to buzz with updates. The hashtag had evolved from hashtag diplomatic crisis to hashtag diplomatic change, reflecting the shift from outrage to reform. International airports worldwide began reviewing their own procedures, not wanting to risk similar incidents. As the press conference concluded, Dr. Okafor's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Officer Chen, the supervisor who had been present during the incident. Your grace under pressure is changing how we do our jobs. Thank you for turning this terrible moment into an opportunity for growth. Later that evening, in a quiet moment in her UN office, Dr. Okafor reviewed the day's events. On her desk lay a brand new diplomatic passport, personally delivered by the State Department's Chief of Protocol. Beside it sat the proposed training manual she would help develop for immigration officers. The sun set over New York City as Dr. Okafor prepared for tomorrow's committee meeting. What had started as a humiliating experience was transforming into a movement for change. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful responses to injustice weren't just apologies, but genuine commitments to ensure it never happened again. 2 weeks after the State Department's press conference, the halls of JFK Airport's Terminal 4 looked very different. Large digital screens displayed clear instructions about diplomatic credentials in multiple languages. New scanning devices sat at every immigration booth, connected to the promised 24-hour verification system. Dr. Okafor stood at the front of a newly created training room within the airport, facing 30 immigration officers. The room was silent as she held up her diplomatic passport, not the cut one, which now sat in a glass case at the UN as a reminder, but her new one. Today, we're going to learn not just about documents, she began, but about the people who carry them. The officers leaned forward, many taking notes. Among them sat Officer Chen, now promoted to lead the new Cultural Awareness Division. Can anyone tell me how many different types of diplomatic passports exist worldwide? Dr. Okafor asked. Hands went up hesitantly. The atmosphere was different from regular training sessions. This was real-world learning from someone who had lived through the consequences of poor judgment. Outside the training room, workers installed new signs above the immigration booths. Dignity, respect, protocol, they read in illuminated letters. The airport had become a model for the changes spreading across the country. Other international airports sent representatives to learn from the new procedures. In a corner of the training room, 2 documentary filmmakers captured everything. The State Department had commissioned a training video, but major streaming services were also interested in telling the larger story. Dr. Okafor had agreed to participate, seeing it as another way to ensure lasting change. "Let's do a practical exercise," she announced to the class. "I want you to experience what it feels like to be questioned about your identity." She pulled out a stack of role-playing scenarios. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but they understood the importance of this training. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the Diplomatic Credentials Respect Act was already showing results. Reports of diplomatic incidents had dropped dramatically. The new verification hotline had prevented 3 potential confrontations in its first week alone. A young officer raised her hand during the training. "Dr. Okafor, what should we do if we're genuinely unsure about a diplomatic credential?" Dr. Okafor smiled. This was the kind of question that showed the culture was truly changing. "Always verify, never assume," she replied. "The new system gives you multiple ways to check credentials without confrontation. Remember, dignity comes first." The training session was interrupted by a surprise visit from the airport director. "Dr. Okafor," he said, entering with a group of international observers, "would you mind if some of our colleagues from Heathrow and Charles de Gaulle airports observe your training? They're implementing similar programs." News crews outside the airport interviewed travelers about the changes. "It feels more professional now," one diplomat commented. "You can see they've really taken steps to prevent another incident." Even regular passengers noticed the difference in how immigration officers handled their duties. During a break, Dr. Okafor checked her phone. The young girl who had witnessed the original incident had started a school project about diplomatic relations. Her teacher had invited Dr. Okafor to speak to the class next week. These personal connections reminded her why the changes mattered so much. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Officers took turns playing different roles: diplomatic staff, immigration officers, supervisors. Each scenario forced them to think carefully about their assumptions and reactions. "Remember," Dr. Okafor said as she walked among the groups, "every passport tells a story. Every traveler deserves respect. Your decisions in that booth can affect not just one person, but international relations." At the end of the day, Officer Chen presented Dr. Okafor with a gift, a framed copy of the new training manual, which would be used at every U.S. port of entry. "You turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change," Chen said quietly. As Dr. Okafor packed up her materials, she noticed a message from the UN Secretary General. Other countries were requesting similar training programs. What had started as a horrible experience at one airport was becoming a global model for change. Sometimes, she thought, the best training comes from the hardest lessons. 6 months after the passport incident, Dr. Amara Okafor stood once again in Terminal 4 of JFK Airport. This time, she wasn't a traveler but an honored guest. The terminal buzzed with excitement as officials and media gathered for the opening of the new International Diplomatic Welcome Center. "Today marks a new chapter in how we welcome diplomatic travelers to the United States," the airport director announced to the assembled crowd. Beside him, a red ribbon stretched across the entrance to a newly renovated area of the terminal. The space featured advanced credential verification technology, comfortable waiting areas, and walls decorated with flags from all UN member states. Dr. Okafor smiled as she noticed a familiar face in the crowd, the young girl who had witnessed the original incident. Now, 6 months later, the girl wore a junior UN ambassador badge, part of a new youth program inspired by recent events. She had written an award-winning essay about that day, which hung framed in the new center. "Dr. Okafor," a voice called out. She turned to see a surprising figure, Officer Jenkins's daughter. The young woman had reached out months ago, wanting to understand and make amends for her father's actions. Now she worked with the airport's community relations team, helping to build bridges between immigration authorities and diverse communities. The ceremony continued as the airport director revealed statistics from the past 6 months. Diplomatic incident reports had dropped to 0. The new verification system had processed over 10,000 diplomatic credentials without a single complaint. Other airports worldwide had adopted similar programs, creating a global network of respect and dignity in international travel. But numbers tell only part of the story, Dr. Okafor said as she took the podium. "The real change is in how we see each other." She gestured to the walls, where photographs showed diplomatic staff from various nations working together with immigration officers in training sessions. A tour group of airport staff from around the world moved through the new facility. They stopped at a special display case near the center's entrance. Inside lay the cut diplomatic passport, preserved as a powerful reminder. Beside it, a plaque read, "From this moment of crisis came a movement for change." The young girl who had witnessed the incident raised her hand during the question and answer session. "Dr. Okafor, do you forgive Officer Jenkins?" The room fell silent, waiting for her response. "Forgiveness isn't just about one person," Dr. Okafor answered thoughtfully. "It's about changing systems that allow mistakes to happen. Officer Jenkins's actions led to important changes that make travel safer and more dignified for everyone. That's worth more than personal forgiveness." Later that afternoon, Dr. Okafor led a special training session for new diplomatic liaison officers. The program, now mandatory at all major U.S. airports, had become a model for international training. Even countries that had been skeptical at first were now sending representatives to learn. "Look at this," her assistant said, showing her a phone. The UN had just released its annual report on diplomatic relations. The JFK Protocol, as it had become known, was cited as a best practice for handling diplomatic credentials. The report praised the United States for turning a crisis into an opportunity for global improvement. As the day wound down, Dr. Okafor took a moment to walk through the terminal. Regular travelers moved smoothly through immigration, while in the new diplomatic center, officials efficiently processed credentials using the new systems. The atmosphere was professional, respectful, and calm. Her phone buzzed with a message from the UN Secretary General. Next week, she would lead a global conference on diplomatic protocols, sharing the lessons learned from this incident with representatives from over 100 countries. Before leaving, Dr. Okafor stopped at the wall of photographs. A new edition showed her original arrival at JFK 6 months ago, paired with today's ceremony. Below it, a quote read, "Progress comes not from avoiding mistakes, but from learning from them." Outside, the sunset painted the sky in beautiful colors as planes took off and landed. Dr. Okafor thought about all the diplomats who would pass through these halls, carrying out their vital work for peace and cooperation. Thanks to one difficult day and 6 months of dedicated change, their journeys would be smoother, their dignity respected, and their missions protected. The incident that began with a pair of scissors and a passport had cut through more than paper. It had cut through prejudice, outdated systems, and rigid thinking. In their place grew something new, a legacy of respect, understanding, and positive change that would benefit diplomatic travelers for generations to come.